It is US weaponry, US financing, US diplomatic cover on the global stage that has enabled and that continues to enable Israel to conduct these operations and to do so without any fear of accountability.
Taking center stage today is Josh Paul. For over a decade, he worked as Director of Congressional and Public Affairs in the U.S. Bureau of Political Military Affairs. It's a role within the State Department involving the approval of major arms transfers and sales. In 2023, Paul resigned from his position in protest over the U.S.'s role in enabling Israel's war on Gaza. Since leaving, he has gone on to co-found a new policy, a lobbying and political organization driving change to U.S. policy towards Palestine and Israel. Paul joins us to discuss his resignation, if Washington has learned anything, or if the U.S. is doomed to repeat its mistakes. Josh Paul, welcome to Center Stage.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start with this. On September 15th, 2025, a UN commission determined that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. The commission alludes to the role of the U.S. when it says the transfer of arms and equipment could amount to aiding in the commission of a genocide, and failure to stop it amounts to complicity. What do you think is the significance of this finding?
So I think, first of all, it is stating what I think has been obvious for a very long time, that Israel's actions in Gaza constitute war crimes now to the point of genocide, just as its actions for many years in the West Bank have constituted apartheid and ethnic cleansing. I think it also, again, confirms that there is a US responsibility here. It is US weaponry, US financing, US diplomatic cover on the global stage that has enabled and that continues to enable Israel to conduct these operations and to do so without any fear of accountability, without any challenge to its ability to operate and to continue to execute these operations that are doing so much harm. So I think these findings coming from the United Nations Commission of Inquiry are certainly significant and will weigh on other countries around the world as they consider their legal responsibilities under the Genocide Convention. I don't know, unfortunately, that they will change all that much immediately in America.
It has to be said the U.S. and Israel have swatted away that characterization of what's going on in Gaza. We're recording this episode in September 2025. The UN General Assembly has convened in New York, and this year alone, 11 countries have recognized Palestinian statehood. There are now 157 UN member states, that's 81% of the General Assembly, that recognize Palestinian statehood. But the US does not. Will this make an impact?
Well, not only does the US not yet recognize Palestinian statehood, but of course we heard President Trump in his speech to the UN echo Israel's talking point that recognition of Palestine is a reward to Hamas. Self-determination is a right under the UN Charter. Self-determination of all peoples is a right, not a reward. And the Palestinian people deserve it as much as any other people on this planet. Whether this shift in America's allies, in particular some of its closest allies, the UK, Australia, Canada, drives any sort of change in America, I think the answer is probably not. And that is because the problem we have here in America is ultimately not a policy problem. It is a political problem. There are plenty of experts within the US government, and of course plenty of people across America who can see that the path we are on is wrong, is harmful, not only to the Palestinians, but also to our own interests around the world. And yet there are political obstacles that prevent us from saying what is obvious and from changing our course. And until those shift, I'm afraid we're stuck.
It definitely doesn't seem to be a perception problem, because a recent Gallup report showed, it was a poll, showed that 32% of Americans, only 32%, support Israel's military actions in Gaza. If there is such underwhelming support among the American populace, why hasn't that translated to a shift in policy on Capitol Hill?
It's 50% now who recognize that what Israel is doing is a genocide, and it's over 60% across all voters, Republicans and Democrats, who think the US should be stopping its lethal military support to Israel. The problem we have is that that popular perception and the mobilizations we've seen on the streets of America, across the campuses of our colleges and universities, is not translating into political change. And that's because, in great part, the American political system is not really set up to listen to the voice of the American people. And what is happening in the context of Palestine actually has reverberations that go far beyond that and implications for the functionality of our democracy, because what it shows is that essentially the views of the American people matter less than the incentive structures for our politicians. Does speaking up, does being critical of Israel get you elected, or does it make you lose your seat? Does it bring you funding for your campaign, or does it bring a candidate to run against you with more funding than you have? Now, that's beginning to change. We saw in the last election, Kamala Harris lose in significant part because she was unwilling to shift on Gaza.
So what do you see as being something that could shift the policy? We had mass protests across the US on college campuses. There has been an outpouring of awareness about what's happening in Gaza as people see images of starvation and mass death. More than 65,000 people, Palestinians, killed in Gaza. So there is awareness. Where do we get from awareness and sympathy towards what's happening to the Palestinians to action by the US government?
So I think ultimately this comes down to political incentives, and I think there are three that really matter. The first and the most important, one would hope, is votes. Whether Americans are willing to come to the ballot box and make this a single issue, make this the defining issue on which they will support an incumbent or oppose them. Another matter here in our system, unfortunately, is money. Are the resources there behind candidates who are willing to speak up, to call what is happening in a genocide, to push for a change in American policy, or are the resources stacked against them? Both of those are things that my new organization, A New Policy, is working to address. The third aspect, frankly, is also public opinion and the Overton window, the notion of what is acceptable to say. And that we do see shifting, and shifting significantly. We see now over 20 members of Congress calling Israel's actions genocide. We see members increasingly willing to speak up to call for suspensions of lethal arms transfers. We have seen former Biden administration officials, senior officials, who could have made these decisions when they were in office, now at least finally saying, this is the time to use the leverage we have through arms transfers, which of course is something that I've been arguing since the day I resigned and before.
So available data shows that between 2023 and 2024, the US gave Israel almost $23 billion in direct and indirect military aid. You are perfectly poised to answer this question. What is this money being used for, and are there any restrictions on how Israel can use this money?
So the majority of this money is being used directly to finance arms, the fighter jets that are dropping bombs on Gaza, the bombs themselves, the firearms, other weaponry. Some of this money is also being used for America's own operations. And this is one of the problems here, right, is that Israel's operations, not only in Gaza, but across the Middle East, increase the chances of conflict, destabilize the region, and pull the US repeatedly into situations where we have to redeploy our forces from the homeland or from the Indo-Pacific back to the Middle East, and this costs billions of dollars. We're putting our forces in harm's way for a conflict that we are not a part of.
And I think a lot of people feel there's a disconnect between this amount of money. Israel is the largest beneficiary of American military aid. It's a country of 9 million, and there is no formal army among the Palestinians that it's facing. How do you sort of reconcile that?
Well, not only is that the case, but Israel also has a pretty successful economy. In fact, they operate a trade deficit with the United States in which we spend more with them than they spend with us. This is something that President Trump in particular has been very focused on. and yet we continue to finance their military, allowing them to finance, for example, free education and healthcare for all of their citizens. I think it is very hard to square those two things, and I think when you actually put politicians on the spot and make them answer those questions, it is increasingly hard for them to defend it, including to both Democratic and Republican bases, where there's significant shifts.
Has the transfer of arms to Israel impacted American military capabilities? I ask this because in June, the U.S. joined Israel in attacking Iran's nuclear sites. And I read that the stockpile of interceptor missiles that Israel was using to protect itself from retaliatory strikes from Iran was depleted. What do you think is happening here? Is the United States defense being compromised by its support of Israel?
Yes, the United States defense is being compromised, and actually in four separate ways. First of all, the drain on our readiness of having to deploy US forces to the region or redeploy them from other regions where they are needed to the Middle East. Second, we are providing munitions directly out of US military stocks. So we are drawing down our own stocks of vital weapons in order to provide them to Israel to conduct its genocide. Third, as you mentioned, interceptors, ballistic missile defense are long lead systems. They take years to build, and we have provided, or we have used in the context of defending Israel, several years' worth of construction in the course of weeks. And fourth, of course, are the threats that we are creating to our own national security by being publicly associated with a genocide. So in all of these ways, there are significant harms that are being done to our own national security.
Let's rewind to October 2023. You became the first member of the Biden administration to publicly resign over the Biden administration's policy with regard to Israel, Palestine, and the war. Your move triggered, I think it's safe to say, other resignations, whistleblowers coming forward, and real grassroots mobilization across the United States. Do you have any sense right now what the mood is like among your former colleagues at the State Department?
Yes, so I talk to my former colleagues at the State Department still, certainly every week and sometimes every day. First of all, I think that they have felt that they are very much under attack with the cuts that this administration has made, and there has been a clear sense that to speak up is to risk your career, risk your job, not only when it comes to U.S. policy on Israel, but really in opposition to anything that the administration is advancing. So I think people are very much hunkered down right now and just trying to hold on to their livelihoods, their careers, and to try to shift things where they can. But I think the space for movement is very limited now.
You are a co-founder of the nonpartisan group A New Policy. Its mission is to have a human rights-centric approach and one that centers American policy in the Middle East, but with regard specifically to Israel and Palestine. Right now, the pro-Israel group, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, is the powerhouse on Capitol Hill. It has the ability to get people elected. It can also harm candidates' chances of getting elected. How do you compete with a group like AIPAC?
Well, I was in a meeting of the House Foreign Affairs Committee last week, and one of AIPAC's lobbyists came in and sat at the other end of the row, and he looked at me and sort of scowled, and I looked back at him and I smiled. And do you know why I smiled? It's because, first of all, I know that we are on the side of justice, but it's also because I know that he has everything to lose and we have everything to gain, that AIPAC is on a losing track. We see members of Congress increasingly standing up and saying they will no longer accept funding from AIPAC. AIPAC spent over $100 million in the last election cycle. You don't need to do that when you're winning. They are fighting a defensive battle, and it is one that we can see, looking at the generational change that is coming, they are going to lose. The only question is how long it is going to take, both in terms of time and in terms of Palestinian lives. But I think the shift is coming. It is on our side. We do need to bring more strategy, more engagement to what we do. And I think we also need to be cautious not to give AIPAC all the credit that they claim. In many cases, they will claim credit for winning races that, in fact, were driven by local issues. They will claim credit for throwing money into campaigns where actually those were probably already going to be decided one way or the other. So I think we need to step back a bit and not give them everything that they say that they deserve.
But you talked about money earlier, and you just mentioned they spent $100 million during last year's elections. How does a new group, like a new policy, again, begin to even compete at that level?
Well, so first of all, they may have spent $100 million. Those who wanted to see a shift on US policy towards Israel and Palestine were also spending in the last election. And by our estimates, spent somewhere in the range of $20 to $25 million. Now, that's not $100 million, but it's not nothing. The problem is that a lot of that money was not spent wisely. It was spent either on candidates who were safe and didn't need the money, or it was spent on candidates whose hearts were in the right place, who said all the right things but never had a chance of winning. What we are trying to do in a new policy is bring some strategy, not only to the politics, but also to the economics, so that we are being more efficient and more effective with the money that is going into this system, and therefore driving change. And look, at the end of the day, AIPAC can spend $10, $20 million in a race. They can't spend $10, $20 million in every race.
How would you spend money in the midterm elections?
So I think, first of all, we need to stand up for those who are already in Congress, who have been very strong in calling for a change, in calling out American complicity in what is happening in Israel, and who are at risk of losing their seats. We need to defend those people. We also need to be wise and use the funding that we have and that we are able to apply where we can, either to elect new members who will speak up, or to shift those who are already in office. And what's been interesting for me in the last few months is that we've actually had incumbents in Congress had their campaigns calling a new policy and saying, I was elected with AIPAC money. I want to get off this train. Can you help us? And yes, we can if you are willing to shift and to speak out.
You've described U.S. policies on Israel and Palestine as myopic, misinformed, and militarized, that it sustains conflict, insecurity, and distrust in the Middle East. Was this a slow evolution in terms of arriving at this conclusion, or was the tipping point when you resigned from the State Department?
No, I think, so I worked in the West Bank for the United States, for the US Security Coordinator, back in 2008 to 2009. I lived in Ramallah for a year and a half and traveled all around the West Bank. And when you are living there and working there, it is impossible not to understand what is happening, to see the checkpoints, to see the dry valleys of the Palestinian villages below and the blue swimming pools of the Israeli settlements at the hilltops, to see the olive groves that are being burned, to see the roads that are being built that are for Israelis only, that bisect Palestinian land. And so I think it has been very obvious to me for a long time that American policy has been on the wrong track, that the Oslo process, frankly, had reached its breaking point. What changed for me in October of 2023 was that even the limited space that was available within the US government to raise these concerns, to debate these issues, to make incremental change, was taken away by the Biden administration, by the president himself, by Secretary of State Blinken, and instead there was just this rush to to provide lethal arms into a context where it was very clear that they were being used to target and to kill innocent civilians. That is a policy, unfortunately, that the current administration continues to this day, and it needs to change.
You know, you spent time living in Ramallah, and this is an issue that's often not talked about, and that is Israel's military actions in the West Bank and plans for the West Bank. Would you like to talk about that and maybe talk about your personal feelings? Because this is personal for you. I would imagine that you made friends and still have people you care about in the West Bank.
Sure. In the West Bank, and for that matter, in Green Line, Israel, I think that there are a lot of people who have been harmed by the impossibility of reaching a just and lasting peace in this conflict. When it comes to the West Bank, I think, first of all, what Americans should realize is that there are actually Americans who are being killed in the West Bank by the IDF, by the government of Israel, with no accountability. with no pursuit of justice, either within the Israeli system or from our own government. But at the same time, I think also we as Americans recognize that our homes, our land are inviolable, that we stand up for them, we protect them. And what we see in the West Bank is a constant attack from settlers who are taking the land from elderly grandparents, who are bulldozing schools in order to build military training ranges. This is a fundamental violation of the freedoms that are core to American values, and yet continue every day, expand every day, and make peace that much more impossible to attain.
We talk a lot in the American media about what Gaza looks like post-war. What do you think the West Bank will look like post-war?
So I think that the government of Israel has been for many years expanding settlement growth. I think what it is doing now, frankly, hand in glove with the settler movement itself, is essentially pushing the Palestinians out of their land. So there are Palestinian villages across the West Bank, and there are a handful, 5 or 6 major cities. What we see is an effort essentially to empty out the villages, to empty out the rural areas, to stop farmers from being able to work their land, and to push people into the cities. And I think where Israel is going is to try to essentially create a series of concentrated population centers that will be essentially Palestinian reservations, right? As we have indigenous reservations here in America from the crimes of this country in the 1800s. But everything else will be Israeli, and there will be a continuous pressure essentially for Palestinians to leave the West Bank. That is Israel's strategy here. It is one that certainly we do see, in fact, probably to a greater extent than in the context of Gaza, Arab states pushing back on because they know how destabilizing that would be for the region. But yet there is not the campaign and the pressure there needs to be to roll this back.
Do you inevitably see the Palestinians in Gaza being forcibly displaced and moved to countries like Egypt and Jordan?
So I think that it is very clear that the plan for now is to forcibly displace certainly a large percentage of the population. I think the question is, when does that southern border to Rafah open? And I think many Palestinians in Gaza will choose to leave simply because there is no economy in Gaza, there is no infrastructure, there is no hospitals, schools, all these sorts of things that make life normal. This is what Israel has done. It has made regular life impossible in Gaza. There's a vital need for reconstruction, but we know, of course, as well, the track record here is that when you leave Palestine as a Palestinian, it is unlikely that Israel will let you back into it.
If a new policy makes the impact that you hope it does, what will the atmosphere be like at the State Department, and what kind of policy will the U.S. have vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine?
So I think the single most important metric will be, can we talk about Israel the way we talk about every other country in the world? For every other country, even countries that are allies, we are able to offer criticism. We are able to debate whether or not we should provide arms. We apply our laws. When it comes to Israel, there are laws on the books that say we cannot provide military assistance to units that have committed gross violations of human rights. We apply those everywhere else in the world. We refuse to apply them to Israel. So I think the single most important metric is not, are we treating Israel worse or better? It's, are we treating them the same as every other country in the world?
Josh Paul, thank you for joining Center Stage.
Thank you very much for having me.